Hello, welcome to the Graveney Psychology YouTube channel's revision video for social influence for the new AQA specification being examined from 2016. The first thing you need to know is about the three different types of conformity that were identified by Kalman. The first type of conformity was compliance. Compliance is when you publicly conform to the behavioural views of the group, but privately you maintain your own views. The second type of conformity is identification. Identification is when you adopt the views or behaviour of the group while you are with them, but that is temporary. And when you leave the group, those behaviours and views are not maintained. The third type of conformity that Kalman identified was internalisation. Now this is a conversion or a true change in your beliefs to match those beliefs of the group. And that is permanent. There are two explanations of conformity that we're going to look at. The first one is normative social influence. Normative social influence is based on the desire to be liked. So we conform because we think that others will approve of us and accept us. And that is associated with compliance. The next explanation of conformity is informational social influence. And that is based on the desire to be right. So we look to others if we're unsure about the situation or if it's an ambiguous situation and we don't know how to act. Now informational social influence is associated with identification and internalisation. So Lataine's social impact theory suggested that we are most likely to conform due to normative social influence when the group is important to us. We want to be liked by them and we spend a lot of time with them. We're most likely to conform due to informational social influence a little bit differently. If we experience situational ambiguity, if we don't know how to act, or if we're in an emergency and we don't have much time to think about how to act. The next thing we're going to look at is variables that affect conformity. Now there are three variables that affect conformity that you need to know about in the context of Ash's research. The first one is group size. So obviously there is little conformity when you only have one or two confederates, but if you have three confederates, according to Ash, conformity jumps up to 30%. It does not then increase after that point, so it's only really a variable up to a certain point. The second variable that affects conformity is unanimity. So unanimity is when everyone agrees with each other. If that unanimous decision is broken, conformity levels drop from about 33% all the way down to 5%. The third variable that affects conformity is task difficulty. So if the task is harder, people are more likely to conform. With regards to Ash's study, if the length of the line, was smaller, so if they were closer together, and it was harder to identify the differences between them, conformity levels increased. You must know Ash's research. Ash's research was the line experiment. You must know it in terms of an aim, procedure, findings and conclusions. You must also know Zimbardos' research. So Ash's research is about conformity. A little bit differently, Zimbardos' research is about conformity to social roles in particular. So be mindful about that difference in terms of answering an exam question. You must know Zimbardos' research also in terms of its aim, procedure, findings and conclusions. I'm just going to run through a couple of evaluative points that you should bear in mind for Zimbardos' research. The first was of demand characteristics. The research has been criticised for the idea that potentially the participants that took part knew what the experiment was about and knew what the experimenter was therefore trying to find, and therefore they adapted their behaviour accordingly. The next criticism is the idea that Zimbardo has been criticised himself for exaggerating the role of the situation. Really, only about a third of the guards behaved in a brutal manner. But when you think of Zimbardo's research, you think it was far more than that. And that exaggeration is very much a criticism. The next thing we're going to look at quickly is obedience. So obedience is the result of social influence where someone acts in response to a direct order from an authority figure. And it's assumed that without that order, they wouldn't have acted in that way or done that behaviour. So obedience and conformity are different. Please, please, please do not get them confused. So obedience is about a direct order from someone, and majority influence is more to do with an indirect pressure. With regards to obedience, the research you need to know is Milgram's research. You need to know it in terms of its aim, procedure, findings and conclusions, and you must also know some of the variations of the research. I wouldn't learn all of the variations of the research, but if you know a couple of them and the results of those variations, that would also be very good. The situational factors you have to know with regards to obedience is also somewhat linked to Milgram's research as well, are proximity, location and uniform. Additionally, you could know studies other than Milgram's research that are in line with the ideas of proximity, location and uniform. So Hoefling's obedient nurses, for example, he found that 21 out of 22 nurses started to give the medication when instructed to do so over the phone. Rank and Jacobson, however, did a sort of similar experiment, and they found that only 2 out of 18 proceeded to prepare the medication. And that's to do with how people will obey if they're in a certain location or if they have proximity to the person who is telling them to obey or not. The other situational factor for obedience is uniform, so of course you're more likely to obey the orders or instructions from someone who is wearing a uniform, and related to that is Bickman's study in New York, so you were most likely to obey an experimenter if they were dressed as a guard, and much less likely if they were dressed as a civilian. The first explanation of obedience that we're going to go through is agency theory. Now, Milgram suggested that people operate on 2 levels, the autonomous level and the agentic level. The autonomous level is when you behave completely voluntarily, you do what you want to do and you're aware of the consequences of your actions. On the other hand, the agentic level is where you see yourself acting as an agent of someone else and therefore you are not responsible for your actions. Now, obedience is due to a move from the autonomous to the agentic. So therefore, agency theory sees obedience occurring in this hierarchical social system. People are acting as agents for those who they perceive to be of a higher rank than them. There are a couple of binding factors which operate to keep someone in an agentic state. So first of all, you might not want to appear rude or arrogant by going against the status quo, and you wouldn't want to increase your own level of anxiety by going against the status quo, and therefore you obey. The second explanation is the idea of legitimate authority. So we obey someone who we perceive to be in a legitimate authority position. So we might feel obligated to them because they're in power, we might respect their credentials, we might assume that they know what they're doing. It might be because they're wearing a uniform that we think that they're a legitimate authority. Their roles are generally defined in society, so something like the police or a teacher, for example. And it usually gives the person the right to exert control and power over the behaviour of others, and those others usually accept that. Another explanation for obedience is the authoritarian personality. Now, people who have the authoritarian personality have respect for authority and they are submissive to authority. They hold contempt for people who might be of an inferior social status to them. They have highly conventional attitudes to sex, race and gender, and they are very, very much inflexible. The authoritarian personality is measured by using something called the F scale, which was developed by Adorno in 1950. F stands for fascist, the F scale. It included statements such as obedience and respect for authority are the most important virtues children should learn. Rules are there for people to follow, not to change, etc. According to Adorno, the origins of the authoritarian personality come from sort of harsh parenting in childhood, strict discipline, expectation of loyalty and high standards. The next thing we're going to discuss is resistance to social influence. So there are 2 explanations. They are situational explanations and dispositional explanations. The situational explanation is that of social support. So you can resist social influence if you have social support. Or you could resist social influence if you have a particular locus of control, and that is our dispositional explanation. So first of all, social support. Research suggests that when there's somebody else in the social situation who doesn't conform or doesn't obey, it becomes easier for us to also disobey or for us to not conform. Pretty straightforward stuff there. Now, social support in terms of conformity, so the dissenter, the first person to go against that, represents the social support and they break the agreement of the majority, and then others can obviously go along with them as well. With regards to obedience, people are more likely to resist the pressure to obey if they can find someone who they can ally with. So they find an ally who's willing to join them in opposing or disobeying that behaviour. Disobeying that authority figure. Those disobedient peers then start to act as role models, and more people can then disobey or resist social influence pressures. Another explanation is locus of control. Now, locus of control is a dispositional explanation, so it's a personality dimension that concerns the extent to which people perceive themselves as being in control of their own lives. So people who have an internal locus of control, so internals believe that they are in control of their own life, they believe that things happen as a result of their own choices, their own actions, and they're more resistant to social influence. Those who have an external locus of control think that things happen to them because of luck and fate, and therefore they are more likely to go along with, so they are more likely to obey and they are more likely to conform. So internal locus of control, more likely to resist pressures of social influence. External locus of control, less likely to resist pressures of social influence. Minority influence. So minority influence is a type of social influence that motivates people to reject the established majority group norms as a result of their exposure to a persuasive minority. Now this happens through a process called conversion. So minorities have three behavioural styles. Influential minorities anyway have three behavioural styles. The first is flexibility. So Mugni suggested that in terms of their negotiating styles, a minority group has to be somewhat flexible. If they're seen as too rigid and dogmatic, people won't go along with their view. The second behavioural style is consistency. So Wood suggested that when people are first exposed to a minority view, they assume that they're wrong, because it's something that they might not have heard before. However, if that minority is consistent, then they are more likely, again, to be influential. Finally, the third behavioural style of an influential minority is commitment. So if they are committed to what they are saying, committed to their cause, that suggests certainty and confidence and courage in the face of hostility. They are more likely to be influential. A piece of research that supports this was by Nemeth and Brillmeyer. So they conducted a study on minority influence where a mock jury was... they conducted a study where a mock jury was asked to consider the compensations for a ski accident. There were two conditions. The Confederate did not budge from their original position, and the second condition where they were more flexible and they were adjusting their figures slightly towards the group mean. The findings were that majority opinion shifted more when the minority Confederate was flexible, suggesting that flexibility does have an influence on changing the views. Another piece of research is by Moscovici. So participants were shown a series of blue slides, and they varied only in intensity. A consistent minority influenced the participants to say green on 8% of the trials when really all the slides were blue, and the inconsistent minority had very little influence. This shows that consistency is an important behavioural style for minority influence to occur. Now those pieces of research, Moscovici and Nemeth and Brillmeyer, can be used to support your AO1, which will be theoretical in this area. With regards to social change, so minorities can lead to social change if they are influential enough. Now I think this is a particularly important area of research because this is why we have been able to undergo, social change has occurred in a number of different ways that are important to us. For example, women's rights, LGBT rights, the fact that we now recycle, etc., etc. And those examples are often used in the exams. So Moscovici explained minority influence through the idea that if an individual is exposed to a persuasive minority, they can convert. A conversion can take place, and then social change begins to occur. So a number of different processes can explain how conversion takes place. The first one is minorities should draw attention to their issue through social proof. Now, they bring about social change by drawing attention, to the issue. Now, for example, if you look at Fathers for Justice, they obviously scale tall buildings dressed in superhero costumes. Now, that's how they draw attention to their issue. Cognitive conflict is the next one. So minorities should persuade the majority to think more deeply about these issues. Consistency of the position is another area. The augmentation principle, which is to do with how willing you are to suffer for your views. And there are examples regarding that from the suffragette movement. Another one is the snowball effect that I'm sure a number of you will be familiar with. And that's the idea that while the idea might start out small, as views spread, they become bigger and bigger in society until it leads to a widespread social change. And then finally, the idea of social crypto-amnesia, where the minority views are associated so strongly with this, with what we believe in society, that we forget who almost came up with them in the first place. So we forget the negative identity of the source. And we take on the positive behaviour. So, for example, it's quite clear to see how that has happened in recycling, for example. Obedience can also lead to social change. So Zimbardos suggested that gradual commitment is the idea that leads to social change. So one small instruction is first obeyed and it becomes bigger and bigger, and it becomes more difficult to resist a bigger one. And in terms of examples, you can see that through research by Milgram, but also in terms of the real world, through the behaviour of Hitler and the Holocaust. It's also important to note that obedience can lead to social change slightly differently through the role of disobedient role models, for example, Rosa Parks. So all you need is one person to go against what the norm is, and then more people will follow. Majorities can also lead to social change through this idea called social norms intervention. So what you do is you essentially advertise the behaviour that most people are doing, and then that can potentially lead to social change as well. So Perkins and Berkowitz argue that if people perceive something to be the norm, they tend to change their behaviour to fit the norm. The evaluative material for that is A, the Most of Us campaign. That obviously reduced drink driving after a social norms intervention. So what they did was a poster campaign saying, I don't know, 4 out of people, for example, don't drink and drive, and therefore that then had an impact on drinking and driving. It reduced it. De Jong in 2009 also suggested that De Jong suggested that those sort of campaigns are actually unsuccessful. So in terms of the evaluation, you've got a suggestion that those campaigns are successful and that they are unsuccessful. With regards to essay advice on that final essay to do with social change, you want to define what social change is, you want to suggest a strategy that brings about social change, you want to then evaluate that, and you want to use research, and you want to use lots of real-world applications as well. For example, the suffragette movement, like we have already said. And that is the end of the social influence video. Please make sure you check out the other revision videos that are available on the Gravely Psychology YouTube channel, and also follow us at Gravely P. Thank you.